Step number 15 is the specifications review. Now, many of your projects that you have may or may not have a spec associated with it. Regardless of whether there is a spec or not, you should have some type of guideline to go off of. There's two different kind of specs I typically use. One is the UFGS spec, which you see right in front of you here. It's the Unified Facility Guide Specification. Now, this is the master spec that most large federal agencies use, like the Corps of Engineers and NAFAC. Usually, typically, what they go through and they put into the general requirements section of the specifications. You can see it's 19 pages long. There's a lot of information here, and it can kind of be a little bit overwhelming. So rather than going through these 19 pages, what I have done is I have gone ahead and summarized it into this. This document is the just basically a cheat sheet of the specifications review. Now keep in mind, at this point we have gone through step 1 through 14. We have a schedule that's almost complete, except for the final review, and we just want to verify things are correct before we do our final review. So the first item here is Project Scheduling Technical Specifications 013201. That's the UFGS spec right here, 013201. I would highly encourage you to open up your project specs and look into that section to see if there's actually a scheduling spec written into the contract. Most of the time you probably won't see it unless you work with an agency like the Corps of Engineers or NAFAC. The next thing you want to look at is the solicitation, the award letter, the SF 1442. That's going to give you things like what the dollar value is, how long the project duration is, the scope of work, contractual dates you're required to get. So if we were to open our schedule, we would look to see, okay, is our duration correct? Is it within the time frame? Is the dollar value correct? Those type of items. The next item is look at the letters. You want to look at the NTP letter or an award letter. Those will give you exact dates that you need to drill into your schedule. Your baseline schedule needs to have these accurate dates. The reason being is because NTP does not have a predecessor, so it's going to go off the start date. So it's very important the start date for the project matches up with that notice to proceed. So kind of going through the dates here, we just talked about notice to proceed, the contract duration, contract completion date. We need to verify those are correct. We need to look at all the contractual dates that are required in the contract if there's phasing work that takes place. We want to look at the contract schedule of values. We want to make sure the dollar values we have with the correct CLINs, what they call CLINs, which are coded line item numbers, that they're correctly cost loaded into the schedule and may be broken down into different areas for budgeting purposes. You want to make sure everything lines up. At the end of the day, the total dollar value definitely needs to line up. You want to look at scope, the mandatory tasks, and critical dates. Those will be outlined in the general requirements section of the specifications, the 01 specs. Submittal review and approval durations. In the spec, it'll tell you how long, say the government or the owner has to review, any individual submittal. Same thing with closeouts, commissioning, design. It'll have specific durations, usually quantified in calendar days, not work days. Typically, they'll want things submitted electronically. It may be an MPP file, a Microsoft project file, or different types of software file. You want to make sure you can open it and import it, or save it, and successfully transfer the information. So you probably want to close it and reopen it just to verify. You want to make sure you have hard copy documents you can submit. Most agencies today allow you to submit electronic, but there also may be a hard copy that needs to go into the file. And once we get into the reports section of the training, we'll talk about some of these reports, but these are just some of the reports that are necessary. Here's some general schedule review items. So first of all, is your data date correct? So go into your software, and for the baseline schedule, you go under project information, and you want to make sure your data date, your current date, your status date, and your start date are all the same. So this should actually be 7/5/17. It shouldn't be 10/12 because the current date is today. That's the way the software looks at it. So we want to make sure it's 7/5, and the status date we also want to make sure it's 7/5. So we hit OK. So that gets make sure that the data date and the data dates are correct. NTP milestone, we want to make sure it meets the contractual date. So we open up the schedule. We'll look at the notice to proceed, and we want to verify that 7/5 is when we're actually given the NTP. Next one is the contract completion date milestone, the CCD. We want to make sure the very, very last activity at the very bottom, in this case we don't have CCD, we have CO inspection, right? The closeout inspection. We probably should name it CCD. We want to make sure that date is accurate, okay? And we have it as January 1st, 18, and we also want to make sure that that date has and by the way, it's not a milestone. It's actually, it looks as an inspection, but it should be a milestone, which is 0 days. And we also want to make sure that we have finished no later than a specific date. So we have 1/9. We want to make sure that is, what the contract documents say, and that way we're able to look at the float numbers as discussed previously in the slideshow. We want to look at any other contractual dates. There should be no constraints, and how you determine if there's any constraints in the schedule, you just insert a constraint type, and every single constraint except for the first one, except for the last one, should be as soon as possible. The last one should be finished no later than, but every other activity needs to be as soon as possible. That allows the logic to work. So we want to take a look at that constraint, make sure there's no other constraints. Now if there is a constraint, we're going to actually put a constraint date in where we double click, bring up the dialog box, go to the advanced tab, and we actually give a constraint in here, a deadline. Most of the time you're not going to have constraints. That's going to create many different issues. And of course we look at any other contractual dates. Mechanics is, the software options correct. I'm not going to get into that because we have a standard template set up where we actually have auto schedule and different items put together. Critical activities. Do we have the critical activities identified? In this schedule we do, because you can see we're showing the critical path, which is simply right click, show and hide critical task. The next item is logic. Make sure we have no open-end logic. How do we determine that? Well, do we have simply, if we look at our predecessors and successors, every activity should have a predecessor and every activity should have a successor. And if they do, then you have a closed network. Of course, except for the first activity doesn't have a predecessor, and the last activity does not have a successor. Next, we're going to look at the pre-construction submittals. Do we have submittals, review, and approvals? Do we have those in the schedule? And I know we do because we have different summary tasks for it. Development and review, very important. We also want to look at the descriptions here. Do we have accurate descriptions? Are they verb, noun, quantifiable? So you can see this one, HVAC submittal. Well, that's not really a verb, noun, quantifiable. So we probably want to go ahead and change the description to submittal development. So we submittal development, and we actually put it is. It needs to be verb, noun, quantifiable. That way we have a consistency in the naming structure. The level of detail, we're going to look at activities and make sure that most of the activities fall anywhere between 2 to 12 days. So about 95% of all our activities need to be between 2 to 12 days. How I do this typically is I go ahead and turn off the summary task, and then I view and I can sort by durations. And so I could determine, okay, do we have most of the activities, and if you cycle down, you'll see most of the activities fall within that 2 to 12 day range. So it's a quick way to be able to view and sort. So we can go ahead and turn the summary task back on, and then we can view and sort by start date. We want to look at, so we looked at the durations, the level of detail, make sure they're reasonable duration wise, make sure if there's any lags, there's no negative lags involved there, so there should only be positive lags. So if you have something like this, there should not be a negative there, there should always be a plus sign, not a negative sign. Materials, do we have long lead items? Do we have procurement? Now, the thing about fabrication, there should be 3 different activities per item. There should be fabrication, shipment, and delivery, right? So delivery is one that is cost loaded. The fabrication wouldn't be cost loaded, because remember, we don't get dollar values until we actually get it on the job site. So we don't get dollars, you can't bill for dollars till we get it on the job site. Calendars, do we have the correct calendars put in here? So we go insert column and we look at task calendar, and you can see we have no task calendar design currently, but we basically just need to verify. At this time you're going to have the calendars put in there. Going to verify that everything has a calendar except for the summary task. There is no coding involved in Microsoft Project, so this is a kind of an irrelevant factor, but if you get into coding, there may be a requirement. Project can do this, but that's only for large scale projects. Schedule values, we want to make sure the budgets, the total dollar value matches up with what we have on our estimate, right? We want to make sure it's $724,500. We want to make sure it matches up. Now remember, that's what we're going to bill the customer. This is not what we're going to be billed by subcontractors. So this is a tool, for a billing tool used, is that we can bill the owner and we can agree on percentages. And any other requirements that may be put on here, and I have Primavera there, but that can be replaced by Microsoft Project. Simply any other requirements that are written into the general requirements specification. So I'd go back to the specs, I'd review the specs to see if there's any additional requirements in there. So this here is really a good cheat sheet for you. I consider the spec for schedules to kind of go back and review everything prior to actually submitting the schedule. So very important you go through this step, because it'll catch some of the mistakes that you may make. No matter how we do it, no matter if we go step by step by step, going methodically through every individual step, we're going to miss something. It's inherent in our nature. There's going to be something that goes wrong. So we want to make sure when we go through do a spec review or we do a final review, that we go through and we look at each individual sections. I encourage people to go step by step by step, putting in a task, and then putting in durations, and putting in mandates, and putting in predecessors, because that helps us keep the same thought process as we go through the entire scheduling sequence. So that covers step number 15, spec review.